Okay, there I go again. Okay, chapter 6. I'm going to start reading it, and I'll read it to verse 34, which is as far as we're going tonight. So listen up, follow along in your portions. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. When Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples, the Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Then there was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is a prophet who has come into the world." Jesus, knowing what they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. There they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. They were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone away alone. Then some boats came from Tiberias, landed near this place, and the people who had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus or his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Then they ask, "What must we do to do the works of God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one who he has sent." So they ask him, "What sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. So that's as far as we're going today. Now, let's go back and review some of this stuff, okay? Because we got next week to do the other half.
Next week, there'll be 36 verses because there's 71 total in chapter 6.
It'd be a long night if we did it all tonight. Okay. Sometime after this, okay, sometime after what? Okay. What did he do in the last chapter? Okay. So, testimonies about Jesus. All right. Sometime after this. We don't know how long it was. Jesus crossed. Well, it's coming. It didn't say it was here yet. It said it was near. Okay. So, Jesus crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, when you look on your map, you'll see it either labeled the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. Okay. Well, that's what the Jewish people called it. King Herod, who was the king there, decided he was going to try to butter up the Roman emperor. Okay, so he renamed it the Sea of Tiberias because his name was Tiberius. Not Herod's, but the emperor in Rome. Okay, so he's trying to get some political points there. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw signs he had performed by healing the sick. Okay, he healed the lame man, and he took care of those kind of things, and he was always healing the sick people. Okay. Then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Now, it doesn't tell us he was going to the Passover festival, just tells us it was near. Then Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him. He said to Philip, now Philip is what? Yeah, he's one of the disciples. So he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now remember, they're in a kind of a, well, it was a very poorly, fewly populated area. I mean, you couldn't go down to the store, and buy a bunch of bread for these people. You'd have to go someplace else. Probably Capernaum was the closest place that you could get that much bread. Okay, but Philip says, and remember again, he's thinking as a human, not as, here's Jesus here, okay? Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Okay. And he asked this. Jesus asked him that to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So Jesus already knew what was going to happen, but he wanted to see what Philip thought. So Philip kind of fell where he thought he would, thinking, like a human. Like if I were to say to you, where are we going to feed these 5,000 men? And, go buy some bread for it. How much bread would you need for 5,000 men? A lot, yeah. So he said, Philip answered him, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. So you wouldn't even get a full sandwich, you'd get one bite of bread. Doesn't sound too filling. Well, it was some guys were fishermen, those kind of things, and they figured some of the translations call it 200 denarii. It would take 200 denarii. Well, we don't know what that is. That's not in our coins or anything like that. So when they redid this in the NIV, they said, well, what does that equate out to? And they figured out that the 200 denarii would be about someplace between 6 and 8 months worth of wages. So they didn't make a lot of money then. So he was saying, you know, this is going to take us half a year's wages just to buy so they'd have one bite of bread. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Now, these barley loaves were tiny. I mean, they were not like you think of a loaf of bread like this. They were tiny. And barley was the cheaper of the two. They grew barley and they grew wheat. Okay, but normal people, you know, the working class people couldn't afford a lot of wheat. So they made their bread out of barley, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, it's a little coarser. It's not as tasty as wheat. And 2 little fishes. Okay, I don't know how big they were. Doesn't tell us. Yeah, they were maybe like goldfish, maybe. Who knows? No, I don't think so.
Small.
He said small fish. All right, so here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go? Okay, probably his mom said, you're not going to that meeting to hear Jesus unless you take a lunch with you. You know how moms are. So she packed him a lunch, which most of the commentators agree this was a poor person's lunch. So he's got his little lunch and his little, probably wrapped up in a cloth, who knows. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Okay, 2 things on this verse. Why did he mention the grass? Okay. Yeah. Well, it's rock and sand. It's a desert country. So grass is not that common. So this would be a real treat. This would be like a picnic out in the park, you know, because it's grass and it's soft and you could, you know. And another thing was 5,000 men. It was all men? Was it? Was it? I think it was everybody. Yeah. Women and children weren't really counted. So most of the commentators believe there could have been like up to 20,000 people there. Can you imagine feeding 20,000 people with 5 little barley loaves and 2 little bitty fishes? So there's all those people there. Jesus said, have the people sit down. They sat down. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Okay, so as much as they wanted. So Jesus did not say, here's your little portion of this little barley loaf. He gave each person as much as they wanted. That was kind of unheard of in this time because they just didn't have those kind of resources. Okay. Then he did the same thing with the fish. He gave thanks for the fish and he started handing fish out. So we don't know how many he handed out, but he gave everybody what they wanted. They could. You don't know. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that were left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. 12 baskets full. And remember, he only started out with 5 little loaves. And these were, I mean, we don't know how big the baskets were, but let's call them a bushel. You know how big a bushel basket is? Yeah, it's a little bigger than that. And they had 12 baskets of leftovers. That's a lot of leftovers. So, after the people saw the sign Jesus had performed, and what sign was that? What miracle was that? Exactly. Okay. So, after this, the people saw this sign, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. All right. Can you see where somebody forcing you to be a king would be a problem? Okay. A lot of people wouldn't. They'd love that. Oh, you're going to make me king? Okay, I can go along with that. Okay. But Jesus knew what they were thinking. They were thinking, remember how I talked about they wanted a Messiah king who was going to kick the Romans out? That's what they were looking for. And that's not why Jesus came. So again, he knew that that's what they were thinking. And with a crowd of, say, you know, we don't know, 20,000, 15, 20,000 people, that would create quite an incident. Can you imagine if King Herod heard, well, okay, he said this group over here just made Jesus king. Can you imagine how he would have responded to that? That's right. He'd say, you know, get my troops out there. So Jesus knew that that's what they were thinking. So when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake where they got into a boat. Okay, one boat. Big enough for the 12 of them to get in. It was a fishing boat, more than likely. Okay, so they got into the boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now, do you know how big the Sea of Galilee is? Okay, okay. Technically speaking, they have, you know, obviously measured it, and it has some interesting facts. It is roughly between 7 and 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. So it's not a little lake, it's a pretty good sized lake. And it's the top of the water is 650 feet below sea level. The top of it is 650 feet below sea level. So it's in a bunch of hills and mountains, and it's isolated. Okay, that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the map, you'll see the Sea of Galilee flows into a river, the River Jordan, and then that flows into the Dead Sea, which is even lower. It's lower than that, yeah. It's the lowest point, I think, in the world. So they left. Okay, by now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. Would you take off across a lake that you're going to go, say, 7 or 8 miles across in the dark? Would you get in a boat and try to row yourself across an 8-mile lake in the dark? No. Okay. Well, now to explain things a little bit, some of the disciples, remember, were fishermen. They did their fishing at night. Well, you know why they went at night? Because it was so hot that during the day, the fish would go deep because the water was cooler. So at night, they would come up. And if you're going to net, fish in a fishing net, you need to have the fish there. So they were probably pretty comfortable with getting in a boat and going out at night. The problem was, because of where the Sea of Galilee is, it would sometimes storms would come up real quick and be real windy, so it would whip up a lot of big waves. And there was never any warning. I mean, they couldn't tune their TV to the news and see, uh-oh, there's a storm coming, we better not go. You know, they got in the boat and went. All right, so a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 to 4 miles, and you can imagine how hard it was against a big wind and a lot of waves, so they were really working. When it got rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. Now, I personally can walk on water if it's froze. Okay, can you walk on water that's not froze? Okay. Okay, tell it later. All right, so they're working to get across this lake, and they look up and they see, first they just see somebody, walking on the water. What's going on here? And then says, but he said to them, they were frightened. Obviously, they'd be frightened. Okay, but he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore they were heading to. So Jesus got in the boat, the wind quit, the water went still, and they were already on the other side. And they'd only been about halfway across. He moved it, didn't he? Okay. Yeah, I think he moved the boat. But anyway, the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore, now they're on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Okay. Yeah. Well, you gotta keep straight, because he says on the other side a lot on this one. But he's heading back west, back to Capernaum. No, I thought you were Wayne. Anyway, so the next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore realized that only one boat had been there. Okay, there was one boat there. That's all they saw. And they apparently, because it says Jesus had not entered it with the disciples, but they had gone away alone. So they saw the disciples get on the boat and row away. So their question is, where'd Jesus go? Because they want Jesus. Okay, but they went away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. So they figured it out that, well, he was probably going to Capernaum. It's the only, major town around. Okay, so all these people jumped in boats and went across the lake. When they found him on the other side of the lake, okay, which is the side of Capernaum, the western shore, okay, they said, "Rabbi, when did you get here? You can't walk around that lake that fast, and you didn't get in a boat, so how did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly, I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate loaves and had your fill." So he's saying, the only reason you're looking for me is you want breakfast. You're hoping I'll do that again. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you, for on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval. Then they ask, okay, now this is all those people, "What must we do to do the works of God that God requires. Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. Okay, who did God send? Jesus, yep. So the work that God wants is for these people to believe that Jesus is from him. So they ask him. Now remember, these people are still thinking, the King Messiah and the mechanical things of like, free food and all that. And they said, what sign then will you give us that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? They want him to show them another sign, another miracle. So they've already seen miracles, and they still don't really believe that he's who he says he is. They want to see another one. That our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Again, they're thinking, Jesus is going to hand them a loaf of, I guess, call it holy bread. So that's what they want. And I assume, you can assume a lot of things. A lot of them were probably thinking, if God gave, or if they thought Moses gave them the manna, that, when they were wandering in the desert for 40 years. And actually, none of these people that Jesus is talking to ever had manna. Okay? That was before, when Moses was in charge, and they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. They had manna every day. Yeah. But they're thinking, well, he's going to feed us every day. Now, if you don't have to work to buy your food, can't you do a lot of other weird things? Can't you, if you don't have to worry about working? Well, but that's not why Jesus came. He didn't come to become king. He came to save people. And that's the end of today's portion, this half of chapter 6. Yeah, it's a quote. Okay. So, can you see how people would think that he said that? That means free food and water. Or water or wine. I don't have to work. I just go to Jesus and say, fill her up. Weird, huh? Okay, not why Jesus was here. All right. Any questions? Any from anybody? All right. I'm going to shut down the recording.